Hi, this is Dave Chenault with SkyLite Systems, and in this video I'm going to show you I2P Express. This is a migration tool we've created to help you move your InfoPath forms from SharePoint into lists that are going to help you then use PowerApps and Flow. It also includes a great capability to inventory your InfoPath forms to find out where they are and who last modified it, etc. And I'll take you through a demo of all that today. So let's begin with an inventory of a site that we have where there are a lot of forms libraries in a test environment. So let's go ahead and I'm going to connect to that. And when I connect to it, I can select if I want to scan for forms and lists or just forms. And forms are going to be those complex InfoPath forms that are stored as XML files, where lists are going to be InfoPath forms that use a regular SharePoint list as the data source. Now, lists are very easy to migrate to another list elsewhere because they already are a list. But these forms that are stored as XML files are a big problem. And we have a tool that's going to help you migrate all of the schema into new lists in SharePoint, as well as all of the data that's locked up in those XML files. We're the only company that has a tool like this, and we know there's a great demand for it in the marketplace. So let's get started. I'm going to go ahead and scan this site that I selected for all the form lists and libraries. I can also scan an entire farm if I wanted to. Let me go ahead and kick that off, and then I'm going to pause it while it scans and come right back. Okay, I'm back and we finished the scan of that site. And what you're going to see is it's found a lot of forms libraries in that site. You can tell that because we have the type here. If it was a regular list that uses InfoPath, you would just see it as a list here. But you'll notice all these are form libraries, and those are the tough ones. We're going to explore that in a minute. But if you look across the line here, you'll see the title, the address, how many there are, what kind it is. Let's keep looking here. When was the last time one of the forms was modified within that form library or list? What's the complexity? And by that we mean how many fields are in that form, or does it have a repeating section, or does it have additional data stores behind it or code behind it? So if you take a look at the complexity levels here, it's going to say low, medium, high, or very high. A very high one would have, let's say, some code behind or more than 100 fields, where a low one might be just 25 or 30 fields. So it's going to help you decide which ones should I go after first, what are the low-hanging fruit, and which ones are going to be very difficult for me. Also, I can see if there's code behind them. Those ones are going to be really tough because you're going to have to open up the compiled code with something like Reflector, see what that logic was, and then move that into something else, whether that's, let's say, forms, or you're going to go into, let's say, PowerApps, or you're going to use something with Flow, etc. Different ways to handle those. But you're going to have to figure out a way to replicate the functionality of that code, because you cannot have server-side code in Office 365. You're going to only see this code behind if these are on-premise. If they're already migrated to Office 365, then you will not see any with code behind them. You can also see the last time the template was modified that's behind that forms library, and also who modified it. Now, if you have a blank, like in this case, we can see that the date last modified is blank and the complexity in the template, because that means there's no template at all. That's really bad because it means that you're going to have to recreate that somehow, somewhere along the line. That template behind that form library has become separated from it and it no longer exists. It's very likely those are all going to be zeros. If you look, it's a 0 and a 0. This one actually has 4. But it wasn't used for the last 9 years, so I don't think we have to mess with it too much. You can see that looking at these last modified dates. So this report in the inventory is a terrific way for you to try and figure out how am I going to attack my problem. And you can scan the whole farm, or you can just do a site at a time. It's really up to you. Now, the next thing we're going to want to do is attack these forms libraries, and to do that we're going to have to set up some new lists in SharePoint and map the way that those lists are set up and then the data into them. So let's take a pause for a minute. I'm going to open up a few things here while I'm on pause to show you really what we're up against. So I'll be right back with you. Okay, so let's take a look at a standard InfoPath file or a form that we're used to seeing in the good old days of SharePoint 2013 and even into today. A lot of people use them. And you can see here that we have a simple form, but it does have some complexity to it. There's some repeating sections here in the middle. There's this one section here that repeats and this section that repeats. It also has attachments. So even though it might appear to be a little simple, it's actually not that simple. There's hidden complexity here. And if we're going to transfer this into a PowerApp form, we're going to have to come up with a way to replicate this functionality using SharePoint lists and PowerApps. So let's go take a look at really what is going on here behind the scenes. I'm going to go ahead and go back to that Forms library, and I'm going to open up my Notepad+, because that's going to show me really what's happening behind the scenes. Behind the scenes, what's happening in InfoPath Forms Library is every single instance of a form is stored as an XML file. So each of those forms that I show over here is actually an XML file. And that file looks like this when you crack it open. You can see the from date, the property, the to date, etc., and then the cache on hand, cache period. So let's open up that file again just to take a quick look at it and compare what we're seeing in that XML file. You'll remember it said 570 Wilson. These are the values here. And going back to my XML file, you're going to see Wilson 570. And so you're probably wondering, how in the world am I going to migrate something like this into a SharePoint list that I can use with PowerApps? Well, have no fear. That is what we have built for you with our mapping tool and our migration tool. Before I do that, I also want to show you one other file. Inside of that InfoPath template is the actual schema of that XML file. And this is telling us how information is stored in that XML file. And you'll see here it's got the display name, the account type, the view, etc. There's a lot of fields here. And so we need a way to replicate this schema into lists in SharePoint. That is the first part of the problem. Then the second bit is going to be, how do I migrate each of these files, the data in them, into those new lists in SharePoint so I can then create a new form using PowerApps. So we have quite a task ahead of us, and we're the first company to have solved this problem. And if you look along the left side here, you're going to see some new modules. There's schema mapping, there's export data, import data. So let's start with the schema mapping and take a look at that and understand how this works and what we're looking at. What this does is it will open up that file in InfoPath, and it'll say, here is the data structure in InfoPath, and then here is the structure you want to create in SharePoint. And you can specify whatever data types you want it to be and if it's required. And if it's a repeating section, it's going to generally have something like a group here. And what you're going to want to do is create a new list in SharePoint to hold that, because we're going to have PowerApps make that a reference to another list in that SharePoint site. Okay, so to get all that repeating data that's stored in an XML file, we're actually going to turn this one XML file that we have over here, and that looks like this guy. We're going to turn all those group repeating values, here's one of them for 75, we're going to make those into another list. Anything that's repeating is good, because there could be more than one, it could be many. And in classical sort of IT speak, that's going to be a parent-child relationship, where if you look at this is the parent and these are child items. So this is going to be one list, this main petty cache form, and then this is going to be another list, and this will be another list in SharePoint. And we need the tool to be able to crack open these XML files that I have here and push those into new lists that the tool will create for us using this schema. It sounds pretty complex, and it is, but the tool is going to really help you do that. So what you do is you're going to go ahead and set up the mapping here in this schema. And the mapping is going to say, I want property to be called property over in SharePoint. And I'm going to have this GL code 1 become GL code 1 over in a petty cache list. And then I'm going to have that GL code here turn into the GL code, but in another list called GL payout. Okay? And when I save that mapping, I can use that to export data and then import data. I can also use it to create the lists in SharePoint. So to do that, once I have my schema created, I just select my Create List button here. And what it'll do for me is it'll let me select a site that I want to put all this information into. So let me go ahead and queue all that up. I'll put in the site information and we'll make those new lists with the tool. Okay, I've created a blank team site called Demo 2. And if you look here under Demo 2, it's going to have no lists in it except for just what you get by default. So if I look, I have sort of documents and a few other things here. But I'm going to want the tool to create 3 new lists for me so I can store the data I'm going to migrate out of those InfoPath XML files into these lists so I can make a Power App out of it. So right now we don't have any special lists in here. Let's go back to the demo. I'll just leave this up. Let's go back to the tool. And what I want to do is I'm going to use this site as my target to create the new lists. So let's do that. I'll come back over here and I'm going to put it into my site address. And I'm going to log in. And I'm going to go ahead and give it a name. And I will call this new site list that I'm going to use Migrated Petty Cache. And now I'll go ahead and select Create Lists and let the tool create the list that we're going to use to export data into. Once we've exported the data, we'll import data into that. So let's just let it run a minute. We'll give it a second. It doesn't take very long. And it's going to create those new lists for me over here in that Demo 2 site. So let's go take a look and refresh this page. And what we're going to see is that if I look at the migrated petty cache and I open it up here underneath the settings to see what's going on, I can see that the tool made all of the different fields that I put together in the schema. See all those? And that maps right back to our schema tool here. So basically what I'm doing is I'm making a place for data to migrate into in my target. Next step I'm going to do is export the data out of the old XML files. So the stuff that looks like all of this junk here. I need to be able to get all that data and put it in a form that I can then read and import into that new list that I just created over here in that petty cache site that I made, that Demo 2, if you remember. Okay, so let's go over here and start migrating data out of the old InfoPath Forms Library, and we're going to look at that data and maybe do a little cleanup. So let me go ahead to the Export Data portion of this, and now I'm going to select my target. I remember that it was the procedures. This is the source, and I'm going to log in. And what I'll do is I'll select my source file, which is petty cache. And it's really great here. What I can do is I can start with a particular ID and export out a certain number of items. So if I had thousands and thousands of files, I can do it in batches so that I can sort of break things up a little bit and make sure everything's going smoothly. In this case, I know I only have 15, so I'm going to go ahead and export, just start with 0 and have it as 100. Now, if I want to get advanced, I can actually do a camel query here as well if you're a real hardcore SharePoint guy, and you can specify which ones you want to grab rather than starting with a particular ID and going into a number of them. You can see here we're starting with 0 in the camel request. But I'm just going to go ahead and do 0. And then I can also export all the security settings out. So if I have list settings, it'll pick that up for me. But if I have item level security, it'll also do that for me. Now let's go ahead and export out this data. I don't have any special security on these, so I'll just go ahead and hit an export here. And I'm going to go ahead and put that data into a folder. You're going to see sort of how it looks. What I'll also do is give it a name here. I'll call it Migrated Petty Cache. And I'll just leave it there. It's going to be a CSV file, you might notice. So let's go ahead and do that. It'll take just a minute. And you'll see it start to migrate here. I'm going to put it on pause while it does that. Okay, I'm back. It didn't take very long. And you can see that it's exported out these XML files for me. And let's go take a look and see how they look. They're over here in this final build. There's a number of other things here. But remember that I called it Migrated Petty Cache. But there's also a couple other ones. I've got this Petty Cache GL. And I also have this GL Payout. It's like, why do I have those? Well, let's start off here and take a look here. If I just open up, it's just a CSV file. And what's great about this is we might want to do some cleanup, right? So we might say, I want to change the format of some of these different field values, right? So I'm just going to adjust this so it's auto fit and I can read it better. And I can see there's, everything looks pretty good here, but I might want to manually go through and change some data if I needed to. So I can always do cleanup of my data before I import it in to my SharePoint list that I created. So, okay, that's my petty cache CSV file, and I'm okay with it, but I could do cleanup, and it's likely you will do some of that. A lot of this data you're going to find out is pretty bad, but that's okay. You can do it in Excel. There's a lot of functionality in Excel to do it, and once the data is clean, then you can import it into SharePoint and have a nice clean set of data. Now, what I also wanted to do, though, was take a look at those other files. Let's see what we've got there. And if I look at all my files, I also had these other ones called GL Payout. Let's open that one up. That's an interesting file. And now that I see it, I realize, aha, this is one of those child lists that we set up. Remember, it had a repeating section. This is one of them. And you'll notice here that the parent ID is what we call in IT speak, that's a foreign key, so that I know this child record goes along with whatever ID 8 is in that main petty cache form. And I can see, so there's 2 of those, there's 2 of those, there's 2 of those, there's 3 in number 13, there's 2 in 15, etc. And I have the same option here in, it looks like there's a second one of these guys, the petty cache GL, looks like we also migrated that out. And that's a very simple 3-column CSV file that has child data as well. And you can see this has 2 on 15. It looks like it has none on 9. It has 1 on 11. So different numbers of child records that we have to import in. Okay, so we're getting there. So I'm going to go ahead and pause and get things set up now for the import. Okay, we're on the home stretch now. Now I've got the data exported. I've got the new list created. Now I want to import that data into SharePoint, those new lists. If you remember, they were empty, but they're just sitting there on Demo 2 waiting for me to import that data from those CSV files I created. So let's go ahead and log in. And what you're going to see is I'm going to select the list that I want to import into. So I'm going to select Migrated Petty Cache. Remember, it made that for me. And I want to pick which field should be the title field, because SharePoint always wants a title field in a list. And I could also then use the item level security if we had exported that. Now I'm going to import the data. So what I do here is just select that, and I'm going to select that Migrated Petty Cache. That's the parent, remember? And I'm going to select that and import this data into the new target lists. So we'll give it just a minute to do that. It's pretty fast. You can see it walking through. And the really cool thing that it does also is it supports attachments. So if these guys have attachments, it's going to also import those and save those with the new list in SharePoint. I think we're just about done, but I'll go ahead and pause to let it finish. Okay, I'm back. The operation completed after about a minute or so. And let's go take a look now at what we've got in that new demo site. So if I go back here to my demo 2, and I go underneath site contents, I'm going to look and see how many records I have. If I say site contents, and I look inside of those lists, you're going to see, guess what? All of that data just came in. So this is an extremely big deal. What happened was we extracted all of the data out of these XML files into CSV files. And we mapped them from the schema that's stored with that InfoPath Forms template into new lists, and the tool created the new list for us. And then we went ahead and exported the data, we cleaned it up, and we imported it right into SharePoint, along with all of the attachments as well. Let's look at those. If I come over here into the documents and look at my InfoPath migration samples, let's take a look at that real quick. What you'll see is there's a folder called attachments, and we have a folder for each item that we exported from the InfoPath Forms Library. And you can see the actual document there. That's where we grab it from whenever we do our import. So let's go back over here into the migrated petty cache. We'll open it up. And we can see by opening up maybe one of these guys here, if I click on it, there's all my data. How about that? And I can also see my attachment. And that is the same data that I had over in this guy. If you remember, he had the North State, he had the 500, the 70, the 570, etc. This is another list now. This is going to be another list, 2 lists. And so now the trick is going to be, and let's just double check that real quick. We'll go look and see what we can see in 15. So now what I've done is I actually created a PowerApps form. This took a little work, that replicates the functionality of that original InfoPath form. Here it is here. And I'm just reading from those lists that I have the data in. And you can see the 75, the 500, the 70, etc., and those 2 different child lists. So here's the PowerApp form, and then here's the original form that was in InfoPath. So using our tool, you're able to get the data into a format that'll let you now recreate that capability in PowerApps and continue using the app going on. And remember that all that data is just stored here in lists now in the SharePoint site that we set up to hold all this new target information with the new lists. So let's recap what we did, because that was a lot of information in a short time. What we did is we first did an inventory. And we ran through and did inventory of all the different forms, libraries, and lists within a site or a farm. And then we picked one. And then we did a mapping where we looked at the XML file that's stored with the InfoPath, and we mapped that into one or more new lists in SharePoint. And we selected the different data types of fields that we want in that new SharePoint list. And we created those lists in the new target site, and we have a map set up. Then we exported out the data from our source site, and those were just going to be your Excel files that we had stored out here. Remember, we have the migrated petty cache and the 2 child lists. And then we went back into the tool and imported that data into our target site, Demo 2, and it went ahead and it imported that in. And the last step would be then to go ahead and recreate the functionality, but in a PowerApp form, which I've done here. Now, I don't want to underestimate the amount of work on this. This is some work here because we are going to have to recreate that form and then also do some trickiness with some galleries and PowerApps where we're filtering based on the parent-child. Remember, we had the ID of the parent, and these are the child records we're filtering off of. But the great news is you are able to migrate forms libraries into SharePoint lists. And you can recreate this functionality now in PowerApps and have a way to move forward and use modern tools that are going to give you things like a great ability to have mobile forms. And it's going to be much more responsive designs. And you can do a lot more with it and mash up data from lots of different sources. So this moves us into the modern world very efficiently. So I know it's sort of a long video, but I hope that it was very informative. This is Dave Chenault with SkyLite Systems. I was demoing I2P Express, our brand new inventory and migration tool for InfoPath and InfoPath Forms Libraries. And you can contact us at info@skylitesystems.com, and we would be happy to reach out and help you with your migration or just sell you the tool as well, whichever you prefer. Again, Dave Chenault, SkyLite Systems, thanks for your time.